In this paper, I would like to present some introductory connections between Owen Barfield and Kathleen Raine, highlighting some of the themes that interrelate their work. Themes such as participation, vision, imagination, and meaning. Barfield is perhaps best known for his writings on poetry, the history of language, and a philosophy of participation. And like Raine, his interests as a poet and writer relate to a broad tradition of Neoplatonic thought. Raine writes in her poem Seventh Day that nature sees itself is both seer and seen. Perhaps the word that best describes these lines is participation. These words of nature's vision in us and ours in nature point to the mystery of meaning within poetic language. For we feel, having read such words, that something has changed, that a part of our consciousness has been transformed, that we feel something that transcends time. Words are only themselves by being more than themselves, wrote Barfield. Perhaps the same thing is true of human beings. Participation is very much at the centre of Raine's poetry and experience. Recalling time spent in France, where she would sit and write poetry, Raine describes a moment of intense participation whilst looking at a hyacinth. All was stilled. I found that I was no longer looking at it, but was it? A distinct, indescribable, but in no way vague, still less emotional shift of consciousness into the plant itself. Or rather, I and the plant were one and indistinguishable, as if the plant were a part of my consciousness. I could sense the very flow of life in the cells. I was not perceiving the flower, but living it. I was aware of the life of the plant as a slow flow or circulation of a vital current of liquid light of the utmost purity, apprehended as a whole. This whole was living, and as such inspired a sense of immaculate holiness. Living form, that is how I can best name the essence or soul of the plant. Raine's poetry frequently conveys the ineffable silence of vision, yet of course moved by the beauty of poetic form and expression. It is not birds that speak, but men learn silence, says Raine in her poem, The Speech of Birds. In this poem, and in Raine's experience of living form, we're immediately drawn into the language and imagery of Plotinus's Ennead 3:8, on nature, contemplation, and the one, where he says that, and if someone were to ask nature why it produces, if it were willing to listen and answer the questioner, it would say, you should not ask but understand and fall silent yourself, as I am silent and not accustomed to speak. Understand what then? That what comes to be is my vision in my silence. One of the remarkable elements of Raine and Barfield's poetry and writings is their shared attempts, as both have suggested, to convey the same essential message in different forms. Raine called this drawing upon a certain kind of vision that remains constant. To work in poetic language, to form images with the creative imagination, is to give expression to inexpressible things. As Plotinus's thought suggests, and as Raine's poetry expresses, there is a longing towards something higher, something divine. Our attempts to reach this place, while somehow falling short, are profound transformations of consciousness and a deepening of spiritual knowledge through contemplation. The good, the beautiful, and the one, these are the aims of participation. The imagery of longing, a journey of transformation, and of a fundamental likeness or kinship with the divine is a theme recurrent in the Neoplatonic tradition towards these goals. In Platonic terms, temporal things participate in the eternal and unchanging forms. the ideas, or the good. The intellect is an image, likeness, or impression of the one, says Plotinus. Things become beautiful by participation in forms, he says, and in an association with the divine forms. What then is the significance of Neoplatonism to Barfield and Raine, and how does it connect them? How, indeed, can Neoplatonism be understood as an historical movement of thought to which they both connect? Neoplatonism, wrote Raine, may be compared to an underground river. Wherever its fertilizing stream emerges, there imaginative thought revives, and we have a period of great art and poetry. Elsewhere, she has written that the Platonic tradition may be likened to an underground river that from time to time sends up a spring. Wherever its waters flow, the soul is reborn, and with it the conception of intellectual form, the beautiful and true art. Barfield has also described Neoplatonism as a stream of thought. Mostly you hear it underground, he says, and when its waters do thrust up for a moment to sparkle in the sunlight, it is because they have taken hold of the feeling life and appear transformed as artistic or poetic inspiration. Barfield notes the connection of thinkers in the stream's movement, including Plotinus, Plutarch, Iamblichus, Synesius, Augustine, Ficino, Bruno, Burma, Henry Moore, Shaftesbury, Blake, Goethe, Coleridge, Emerson, and Yeats. Barfield suggests that the stream's voice is also heard in the work of contemporary poets, in whose verses one feels moving the breath of the creative word, the breath of the logos, and of a deep human response to the logos, the breath that is alone the true breath of poetry. The outstanding example of such a poet, says Barfield, is Kathleen Raine. Imagery of streams and currents of meaning recur in Neoplatonic symbolism. Plotinus described the one as the productive power of all things, poured forth as though from a spring. It is participation in this production which compels the search for meaning and self-understanding. Philip Sherard wrote that there is a participative correspondence between visible and invisible, the created and the uncreated, the human and the divine. And the imagery of the waters on which meaning is carried is of a participatory nature. The symbolism of fount, flow, river, and waterfall is replete in Neoplatonic thought. Meaning is sought in an imaginative participation with the divine, and partaking of or participating in these waters signifies an engagement with something higher. The language of participation resounds in Raine's poetry, such as Ex Nihilo, where upon each leaf is traced the pattern of the eternal mind that summons kingdoms from the dust. Above the forests lie the clouds, white fields where the soaring sight rests on the air's circumference, and distant constellations move about the center of a thought by the fiat of that love, whose being is the breath of life, the terra firma that we tread, the divine body that we eat, the incarnation that we live. There is a part of us which is contemplative, a dimension of our being which reveals our participation in something higher. Just as Raine describes this as a pattern, Plotinus speaks of this being like an impression, as have other Neoplatonists. Our vision may be limited, and there may be only so much that we can see or say, but it is because a part of us is like the eternal vision that we contemplate that we are able to see it at all. Barfield draws attention to the importance of a passage in Plotinus's Ennead 1:6 on beauty, which is cited by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. For the one who sees has a kinship with that which is seen, and he must make himself the same as it if he is to attain the sight. For no eye has ever seen the sun without becoming sunlike, nor could a soul ever see beauty without becoming beautiful. The Neoplatonic imagery of likeness informs the philosopher, theologian, artist, and poet. However, although there has been a certain continuity of the language and symbolism of participation, Raine, Sherard, Barfield, and others have charted a certain decline. A whole language of the soul, a whole spiritual science has been lost to us, says Sherard. He adds, the light of divine knowledge is eclipsed in us. In his essay, The Arts and the Imagination, written for the first issue of the Temenos journal, Sherard discusses a radical shift or lapse in our consciousness, a shift, he says, that has been reflected in the sphere of the arts. The consequence of this loss of consciousness, or what he calls shifts in vision from one form of understanding to another, is, he says, that we no longer see the world and its creatures hedged about with an aura of mystery and magic, no longer see the relative made luminous by the absolute, the human by the divine, the natural by the supernatural. Blake is a central figure to Barfield, Sherard, and Raine's writings. And Blake, as Raine has pointed out, believed that vision or imagination is a representation of what eternally exists, really and unchangeably. Raine notes that Blake saw the radical error of the separation between mind and its object, nature. Blake's inspired but uncomprehended message, she says, was neither more nor less than to declare and demonstrate the disastrous human consequences of this separation, and to call for a restoration of the original unity of being in which outer and inner worlds are one. Correctly seen, wrote Sherard, inner worlds are outer worlds are inner worlds. Barfield wrote of the loss for the time being of that felt union with the inner origin of outward forms, which constitutes perception of their meaning. Where then is the path to participation? How can inner and outer worlds connect? Might we find it in Blake's guidance in Auguries of Innocence, to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour? Like Blake's images, there is a parallel in the poetic aims of Barfield and Raine's work, an aim to see in the passing moment an image of the eternal in which we participate. Barfield's intriguing essay, The Harp and the Camera, written in the 1970s, conveys the loss of participation through the predominance of particular symbols. These symbols, the harp and the camera, correspond to both a change in participation and a change in the nature of subjectivity. Barfield's widely expressed ideas on the nature of participation are that a profound transformation in consciousness has taken place. The nature of historical participation, he argues, was once an immanent interconnection or unity of consciousness with inner and outer worlds. But with the advent of the scientific revolution and other changes in the history of ideas, there has been an attendant history of consciousness, and this history has demonstrated a growing separation between inner and outer worlds. This separation has, on the one hand, brought incredible advances in empirical science, whilst conversely creating a loss of participation in the nature of spiritual matters. The Aeolian harp, or wind harp, for Barfield, signifies the original nature of participation, for it is a symbol of inspiration, whereby meaning moves inwards and through it, and where the breath of understanding is reciprocated by the response of the instrument. The camera, on the other hand, represents a form of projection which stands apart from its object. It looks always at and never into what it sees, he says. The imagination is living, says Barfield, the camera's perspective only lifelike. Crucially, Barfield imagines a renewed form of reciprocation in which the past is recovered in the present and the wisdom and vision of historical consciousness matched with a new image and vision. There has undoubtedly been a loss for Barfield, but he sees the active imagination and the continual movement of poetic consciousness to be the means to redeem this loss. In a unity of these symbols, Barfield writes, "Is it fanciful, I wonder, to think of a sort of mini-harp stretched across the window of the eye, an Apollo's harp, if you will, as perhaps not a bad image for the joy of looking with imagination?" Raine's poetry, in its beauty and careful observation, invites such a way of looking, a realization about us that the loss of meaning can be recovered with the imagination. In many respects, ours is a consciousness so deeply shaped by the technological forms of the age, but yet if we take the Neoplatonic dimensions of Barfield and Raine's thought seriously, and the traditions from which they drew, then we can see that it also takes the shape of something which transcends such forms and is a form or image of eternity. In Barfield's conclusion to his book Poetic Diction, written in the 1920s, poetry develops a moved consciousness through its transience. Poetic consciousness, the creative imagination, renews a vision of eternity in its striving for meaning and expression. This is an imagery of creation and poetry's life. And Barfield closes the book by writing that great poetry is the progressive incarnation of life and consciousness. Over the perpetual evolution of human consciousness, which is stamping itself upon the transformation of language, the spirit of poetry hovers forever unable to alight. It is only when we have risen from beholding the creature into beholding creation that our mortality catches for a moment the music of the turning spheres. For Barfield, this vision was to be one in the present. Poetry is only alive to where there is life and therefore movement now, he wrote. The innovation of the poet reveals in metaphor the unity and participation of consciousness. Barfield was deeply influenced by Coleridge, and both might be said to have written a philosophy of the Logos. The word, as Barfield noted of Coleridge's thought, continues active in the word. One finds such imagery at the end of Barfield's poem The Tower, written in the 1920s around the same time as Poetic Diction, where the poet's journey of self-transformation is felt in deeply symbolic form. As imagination becomes, he says, the incarnation of this flesh into this consciousness, where the noise of trumpets in the mouth of wisdom is poesy, expressing incarnation. It was for this reason that Barfield held poets like Raine and their work to be the moving breath of creative word, the breath of the Logos, and of a deep human response to the Logos, the breath that is alone the true breath of poetry. The imagery of the Logos appears in Raine's word made flesh. Statement of mystery, wrote Raine. How shall we name a spirit clothed in world, a world made man? Raine's poetry is alive to the challenges of modernity and conveys a reconciliation to time in its Neoplatonic imagery. Her poetry, like Barfield's philosophy of meaning, speaks to something in which we participate. As Raine writes in the poem Last Things, there is a mind whose here is everywhere, who's now all time, and sometimes we know with its knowledge in dreaming or waking. Whilst working within different currents, both Barfield and Raine's work draws upon the depths of the Neoplatonic stream. Both convey the recurrent imagery of participation and a pattern of meaning in poetic language that seems to speak to something eternal, beyond time, yet present in every moment of participation.